The cabin lights flickered softly over the first-class aisle as a quiet tension settled in the air, the kind you only notice when something isn't quite right. A woman, calm, composed, and carrying nothing more than a small backpack, stood silently beside her assigned seat as a flight attendant argued with her, insisting she must have made a mistake. Passengers shifted in their plush seats, some annoyed, others curious, all of them judging before knowing. And then, as the woman reluctantly turned toward the back of the plane, humiliated and resigned, the thin fabric of her shirt shifted just enough to reveal a glimpse of ink etched into her skin, the unmistakable trident of the United States Navy SEALs. No one noticed it yet. Not until moments later, when the captain himself stepped into the cabin, glanced her way, and froze as if struck by lightning. But how we reached that moment, the moment an entire aircraft's assumptions shattered, is the story we are about to tell. Welcome back to Swift Tale, the place where real-life lessons hide in extraordinary stories. And if you're visiting for the first time, let me ask you something. Have you liked, shared, and subscribed yet? If not, make sure you do, because trust me, you don't want to miss stories like this, stories that reveal the truth behind ordinary faces and remind us how quickly we judge people we know nothing about. Today's tale isn't just dramatic, it's deeply human. It's about a woman who boarded a plane with every right to sit in first class, but found herself forced out, doubted, dismissed, and quietly disrespected. Little did anyone know, she carried a past more remarkable than anyone on that flight, including the crew, could imagine. This story matters because it exposes something uncomfortable, the speed at which people decide someone is less than. In a world where appearances mislead, where assumptions cloud judgment, and where quiet strength often goes unnoticed, this story highlights the danger of underestimating others. It reminds us that heroism doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks quietly, sits low, and minds its own business until someone crosses a line. And when the pilot recognized that tattoo, everything changed. Not because she demanded respect, but because she had earned it long before ever stepping onto that plane. So buckle up, settle in, and get ready, because the journey you're about to hear is more than a flight gone wrong. It's a lesson in humility, a reminder of unseen battles fought by strangers around us, and a testament to the power of staying strong, calm, and dignified even when the world misunderstands you. Welcome to today's Swift Tale. The airport buzzed with its usual cocktail of noise, rolling suitcases clacking over the tiles, gate announcements echoing overhead, and hurried footsteps competing with the hum of exhausted travelers. Amid all the chaos, she moved with a quiet steadiness, almost serene, as if the frantic atmosphere couldn't touch her. Her posture was upright, her eyes sharp and attentive without ever appearing anxious. She didn't check her watch obsessively or fumble with her boarding pass like many around her. Instead, she observed, subtle glances at exits, awareness of people shifting behind her, a natural instinct to scan the environment that came not from fear, but from training. She looked like any other passenger traveling alone, yet there was a calm control in her presence that set her apart, even if no one else noticed it. She approached the check-in counter early, handed over her ticket for first class without hesitation, and received her boarding pass without issue. The agent barely looked at her, speaking in the mechanical tone reserved for passengers expected to follow instructions, not challenge them. She didn't mind. She wasn't here to impress anyone or draw attention. Her outfit was simple, comfortable jeans, a plain fitted shirt, hair tied back in a no-nonsense style. Nothing about her appearance suggested wealth, privilege, or status. And in an airport where assumptions ran wild, that was more than enough for people to label her ordinary. But there were small details, subtle clues, that whispered a different story. The way she lifted her bag with deliberate control that hinted at exceptional strength. The way her eyes flicked toward every announcement speaker automatically, a habit formed by years of listening for sudden changes or danger. The way she instinctively gave people space, yet kept them within her peripheral vision. These were not traits of a nervous traveler. They were the marks of someone trained to operate under pressure, someone who understood risk the way others understood convenience. As she walked toward the security checkpoint, a pair of flight attendants passed by, laughing loudly about their upcoming shift. One of them glanced at her briefly, then dismissed her just as quickly, their eyes drifting toward a businessman in an expensive suit behind her. It was a small moment, but the first of many judgments she would face today. Inside the terminal, passengers crowded around outlets and coffee lines, desperate for energy as the long day stretched ahead. She found an empty seat near a window and calmly waited, hands resting lightly on her backpack, never slouching, never fidgeting. She had learned long ago how to conserve her energy, how to remain still yet prepared. To anyone watching, she seemed like a quiet traveler lost in her thoughts. But behind those calm eyes, she was evaluating everything: the mood of the crowd, the timing of boarding groups, the behavior of the crew gathering near the gate. She was always aware, always ready. Little did she know that the same awareness, the same training that once saved lives, would be dismissed the moment she stepped into first class. And even less did the people around her realize who they were sharing a gate with, a woman whose silence held more strength than most people's loudest voices. When the boarding announcement finally echoed through the terminal, passengers surged forward with restless energy, eager to escape the airport chaos and settle into the illusion of comfort a plane could offer. She rose slowly, not rushing like the others, and joined the line for Group 1 first class and priority boarding. A few passengers glanced her way, doing the kind of quick, silent assessment people often make. Does she belong here? Should she really be in this line? Although no one said anything yet, the unspoken tension settled around her like a faint shadow. She felt it, of course, but chose to ignore it. As she approached the scanner, the gate agent smiled politely at the businessman in front of her, welcomed him aboard, and complimented his loyalty status. But when it was her turn, the agent's expression stiffened almost imperceptibly. The smile faded, the tone flattened. "Boarding pass, please," she said, as if expecting a problem long before one existed. She handed it over calmly. The agent scanned it, and for a split second her brows lifted in mild surprise, confirming exactly what she suspected. This woman actually did have a first-class ticket. But instead of letting her pass, the agent paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "Ma'am, this is a first-class boarding pass," the agent said slowly, as though explaining the concept to someone unfamiliar with it. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" Without irritation, without attitude, she simply nodded. "Yes, that's my seat." Passengers behind her shifted impatiently, but the agent continued examining the pass, tilting it under the light, tapping the screen, searching for some reason to deny what was clearly valid. At last, she forced a tight smile and said, "Of course, you may go ahead," in a tone that carried far more reluctance than professionalism. Stepping onto the jet bridge, she felt the temperature drop along with the energy of the crowd. The murmurs behind her grew louder now that they thought she couldn't hear. "Strange, she doesn't look like first-class material. Probably flying on someone else's points. Or an upgrade mistake." None of it surprised her. People liked to categorize others quickly. It made them feel secure. What amused her more was how wrong people often were. Inside the aircraft, the flight attendants at the door greeted each first-class passenger with bright smiles until she reached them. One attendant's warmth cooled instantly, replaced with that strained politeness people use when dealing with someone they've already judged. The other attendant looked her up and down, eyes lingering on her simple clothing and then on her inexpensive bag before turning back to the next passenger as if she were already an inconvenience. She located her seat, stowed her bag, and sat quietly, her posture straight and composed. But the moment she settled in, the murmurs began again, this time from within arm's reach. A woman in designer clothes sitting beside her glanced over with a mixture of annoyance and superiority. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" the woman asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. "Yes," she replied simply. The woman frowned, tapping her manicured nails on the armrest. I guess they'll figure it out." Moments later, a male flight attendant approached her row. He wasn't angry, but he carried an unmistakable air of suspicion. "Ma'am," he said, leaning slightly toward her, "may I see your boarding pass again?" She handed it over without hesitation. He scanned it, checked the seat number, checked the name, checked it again. His confusion deepened. He forced a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll be right back." As he walked away, the designer-clad woman smirked, assuming vindication. There it was, subtle assumptions turning into open doubt. whispered judgments becoming blatant questioning, the spark of the conflict that would soon escalate far beyond a simple seat dispute. And yet through it all she remained still, silent, unbothered. Because she knew, better than anyone else on that plane, that calmness wasn't weakness. It's control. The flight attendant returned sooner than expected, his footsteps sharper, his expression tighter, carrying the kind of forced confidence people wear when they're about to do something they know isn't entirely right. Passengers looked up, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Conflict always draws attention, especially in first class, where people expect comfort, not disruption. He stopped at her row and cleared his throat, attempting professionalism, but failing to hide the irritation behind his eyes. "Ma'am," he began, holding her boarding pass between two fingers as if it were a suspicious document, "we're having an issue with seat assignments. It appears this seat may not be available for you after all." She met his gaze calmly. "My ticket says 2A, that's this seat." "Yes," he replied quickly, "but sometimes the system, well, it can glitch." He didn't believe his own words. Neither did anyone listening, but passengers were already nodding, eager to see her moved somewhere, anywhere else. The woman in the designer outfit beside her folded her arms with a satisfied smirk, as if order was finally being restored. The attendant pressed on, "We'll need you to move to another seat in the cabin." Her voice remained measured, "In first class." His hesitation said everything. "Well, no," he admitted, "we'll be moving you to economy." A quiet wave of shock rippled through the cabin, not because of the injustice, but because of how bold the decision was. Someone in row 1 muttered, "I knew it," while another sighed with relief, as though her presence had been lowering the value of the entire section. She didn't argue, she didn't raise her voice or create a scene. Instead, she simply asked, "Is there a reason?" The attendant stiffened, caught off guard by her composure. He had expected outrage, something he could use to justify the removal. Her calmness left him with nothing to hide behind. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, "we are trying to accommodate a passenger of higher—" He paused, searching for a polite word. "Priority." The woman beside her chimed in loudly, "Oh, that makes sense. Some seats just aren't meant for everyone." The insult hung in the air. The attendant didn't correct her. That was all the confirmation anyone needed. In their eyes, she didn't belong. With no further explanation, he gestured toward the aisle. "Please gather your things." For a moment, silence wrapped around her like a protective shield. Then she nodded once, controlled, deliberate, and rose from her seat. She retrieved her backpack, sliding it out with a quiet precision that contrasted the messy discomfort around her. Every movement was fluid, almost graceful, the kind of discipline that comes from years of training one's body to obey under pressure. But no one recognized it. To them, she was simply complying, simply giving up. As she stepped into the aisle, the stares hit her from every angle. Disapproval, judgment, curiosity, superiority. Not one person spoke up, not even to question the decision. Not one asked whether moving her was fair. They were too comfortable letting the situation confirm their assumptions about her. The walk down the aisle felt longer than it should, each row a silent reminder of how quickly people decide your worth. A man whispered to his wife, "She probably didn't pay for that seat anyway." Another mumbled, "Good thing they caught it before takeoff." Yet through all of it she held her posture, shoulders straight, steps steady, eyes focused ahead. She had walked into far more hostile environments than this. She had stared danger in the face without flinching. Compared to those moments, this humiliation was nothing more than noise. But like all noise, it lingered. By the time she reached the economy section, a different kind of silence awaited her, not judgmental, but cramped, weary. Indifferent, the attendant pointed to an empty middle seat near the back. "Here you go," she said nothing, simply sat down and adjusted her backpack beneath her feet. Her breathing remained even, her expression unreadable. No one knew that the tattoo hidden beneath her shirt, one they had dismissed, overlooked, or never seen, told a story that would silence every voice on that plane. No one knew that this humiliation would soon become their regret. And no one knew that the pilot, just minutes away from stepping into the cabin, would recognize her, not as a mistaken passenger, but as someone who had once been part of the most elite fighting force in the world. The narrow aisle stretched before her like a long, silent tunnel, a path no one ever wants to walk after being singled out, judged, and displaced. Each step she took away from the polished luxury of first class seemed to echo louder than the last, not because she made noise, but because humiliation has a way of amplifying the quietest moments. Behind her, the flight attendant marched with forced authority, as if shepherding a problem passenger out of a place she didn't deserve to be. In truth, he was following her, not leading, but the narrative he wanted the cabin to see was clear. She didn't belong here. Passengers sitting in the front rows turned their heads without shame, their curiosity stronger than their manners. One man leaned halfway into the aisle just to get a better look at her, as though expecting to see something suspicious that would justify her removal. A couple whispered behind cupped hands, their eyes darting over her clothing, her backpack, her every step. No one knew her story, but everyone was ready to invent one that made sense to them. In their minds, she was a fraud, a mistake, an intruder in a section they saw as reserved for the privileged. And like most people, they didn't hesitate to judge when given even the slightest excuse. With each row she passed, she felt the weight of their stares, not because she cared what they thought, but because she had seen this look before. It was the same look people gave new recruits in training, the same look civilians gave soldiers in airports after deployments, a mixture of curiosity, ignorance, and quiet superiority. It never bothered her then, and it didn't bother her now. But what did strike her was how predictable human behavior was. They saw her silence and humility as weakness. They mistook her calmness for compliance. They assumed their assumptions were reality. She kept her gaze forward, her posture steady, moving with the same controlled grace she used when carrying out missions where a single wrong step could mean death. Of course, no one on this plane knew that. To them, she was simply walking, just another passenger being shuffled like luggage. But to her, every step was deliberate, purposeful. She had learned long ago how to carry herself with dignity even when others tried to strip it away. By the time she reached the middle of the cabin, the stares softened. Economy passengers were different, more tired, more human, less eager to judge. A few even offered sympathetic glances, recognizing the humiliation without understanding its cause. Some moved their belongings aside to make room as she passed, small gestures of kindness that contrasted sharply with the cold indifference she had just faced. But she didn't dwell on either reaction. She simply continued forward, breathing evenly, controlling her heart rate the way she had been trained to do in far more stressful situations. Finally, she reached the back of the plane, where the seats were narrower, the legroom tighter, and the expectations lower. The flight attendant pointed to a cramped middle seat between two strangers who looked as confused as they were uncomfortable. "Here you go," he said, his voice clipped, as if giving her a punishment rather than a seat. She nodded once, slid into the tiny space, and tucked her backpack under the seat in front of her. Her knees brushed the seat back. Her shoulders touched both armrests. None of it bothered her. She had slept upright in transport planes for days, dozed in desert outposts under scorching sun, and rested in barracks so loud they made airports seem peaceful. If anything, this was easy. But humiliation isn't physical, it's emotional. And though she remained outwardly calm, the memory of the walk from first class to economy lingered like a bruise you don't feel until someone presses on it. She closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to anchor herself. She reminded herself that dignity isn't given by others, it's maintained by oneself. They could move her seat, but they couldn't move her spirit. As the plane continued boarding, passengers trickled past her, unaware of the storm quietly gathering in the captain's mind just a few rows ahead. Unaware that the tattoo hidden beneath her shirt held the power to change everything. Unaware that the woman they had dismissed so easily had saved lives, neutralized threats, and endured hardships none of them would survive a day through. For now, she remained invisible. But that invisibility was about to shatter. The plane doors were still open when she finally settled into the cramped economy seat, her backpack tucked neatly beneath her feet, her breathing steady despite everything that had happened. Boarding continued in waves, families juggling strollers, business travelers glued to their phones, tourists fumbling with overhead bins. She remained still, offering quiet space and shifting slightly whenever someone squeezed past her. The people around her didn't know her story, and unlike the passengers in first class, they weren't trying to guess it. They were simply trying to get through their day. One of the flight attendants from the back of the plane, a younger woman who had been rushed off her break early, walked down the aisle to rearrange bags in the overhead compartments. She was flustered, overworked, and moments away from running out of patience, though not because of the woman sitting calmly in 27B. As she reached above the row, she spotted a large suitcase wedged poorly into a compartment and tugged at it with irritation. The bag didn't budge. She tried again, and this time she accidentally knocked another bag loose. The bag tumbled forward. Instinct, pure, sharp, trained instinct, took over. Before anyone else could react, the woman in 27B reached up with one smooth, controlled movement, catching the falling bag with both hands before it struck the elderly passenger seated in the aisle. The grace, the precision, the speed, it all happened so fast that the attendant and the nearby passengers froze in shock. Thank you, the elderly man stuttered, blinking at her as if she had performed some impossible magic trick. She simply nodded and lifted the bag back into the compartment. The muscles in her arm flexed as she slid it effortlessly into place, a movement so controlled it didn't align with her simple clothes or quiet demeanor. But as she reached up, the hem of her shirt rose just enough to expose a portion of her back. Just a small portion, just enough. The faint golden edge of the U.S. Navy SEAL trident, not a decorative tattoo, not a stylized imitation, but the real insignia few earn and even fewer wear. The flight attendant saw it first. Her eyes widened, confusion flashing across her face. She stared for a moment too long, as if trying to decide whether she was seeing what she thought she saw. Then she looked away quickly, shaking her head, convincing herself it was nothing, maybe a fake tattoo, maybe an overly patriotic design. After all, what would a Navy SEAL be doing in economy, or on this flight, or dressed so plainly? Her mind dismissed the possibility almost as soon as it surfaced. People tended to believe what was easiest, not what was true. But another set of eyes had seen the tattoo too. The male attendant from first class, returning to the back for a supply cart, stopped mid-stride. His gaze locked onto the ink with an intensity that startled even him. He didn't speak. He didn't move. For a moment, he simply stared, as if trying to place a memory or confirm a suspicion. The recognition didn't fully hit him yet, but something about the tattoo unsettled him. He took a cautious step forward, lowering his voice. "Ma'am, that tattoo on your back is that." She pulled her shirt down gently, covering the ink. "It's nothing you need to worry about." Her tone wasn't rude, but it held a finality that stopped him from pressing further. She turned her attention back to the window, as though the brief exchange had already slipped from her mind. But the attendant couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her, much more than he had assumed. Still, he walked away. He wasn't the one who would connect the dots. He wasn't the one who had seen a sealed trident before on someone who mattered. He wasn't the one whose life had once depended on people who wore that exact insignia. That person, the only person on the plane who truly understood what that tattoo meant, was still in the cockpit, reviewing paperwork, unaware that just a few rows behind him sat someone he never expected to see again. Someone who would make him freeze the moment he stepped into the cabin. Someone who had already changed the course of the flight without saying a single word. In the cockpit, the pilot was finishing his pre-flight checks with the familiar precision of a man who had spent half his life in the air. Captain Dawson was a calm, methodical presence, respected, steady, and known for his ability to stay composed under pressure. But today, something tugged at the back of his mind. A strange heaviness sat in his chest, the kind that comes not from stress, but from intuition. He couldn't explain it, he just felt it. Something on this flight wasn't like the others. A knock sounded at the cockpit door. "Captain," a flight attendant said, "we need you up front for a moment." He nodded, unstrapped his harness, and stepped into the cabin as passengers were still settling in. As always, heads turned, pilots carried a certain authority that made people straighten up automatically, but he barely noticed the polite smiles and nods. His focus was on the issue the head attendant had mentioned, a passenger complaint, a seat mix-up, something about an economy relocation. Nothing unusual, just another day in the air. He started walking down the aisle, checking the overhead bins and greeting passengers with professional warmth. His stride was relaxed, his uniform crisp, his presence reassuring. But as he approached the middle of the cabin, something, he didn't know what, made him glance left, as though pulled by instinct rather than conscious thought. That's when he saw her. Not her face at first, not her calm posture, not the small backpack tucked neatly at her feet. He saw the tattoo, just a small portion visible where the collar of her shirt had shifted as she leaned slightly to adjust her seatbelt. But it was enough, more than enough. The golden edges of the sealed trident, worn, faded, unmistakably real, glinted under the soft cabin lights. He stopped walking. Not paused. Stopped completely. The air in his lungs froze like someone had punched him beneath the ribs. His heart stuttered, his eyes locking onto that tattoo with a recognition so deep it shook him. He knew that insignia. Not in a casual way. Not in a military buff way. Not in a seen it on TV way. He knew it because he had seen it in the worst moment of his life. A desert night. A downed helicopter. Searing pain. Sand filling the air. Gunfire. Screams. And the shadow of someone wearing that exact trident pulling him out of the wreckage before everything went dark. He inhaled sharply, memories crashing over him with the force of an explosion. No, it couldn't be. Not here. Not on his flight. But the posture. The controlled breathing. The quiet alertness. The discipline in her movements. He knew. He stepped closer as though drawn by gravity, his voice barely above a whisper. "Excuse me, ma'am." She looked up, her eyes meeting his with the unflinching steadiness of someone who had seen more than most people could endure. For a moment, neither spoke. Passengers around them sensed something shift, a change in tension, but didn't understand it. He swallowed hard. Are you?" He couldn't finish the sentence. She gave the slightest nod, not a boast, not a confirmation meant to impress, just an acknowledgement of truth. And it was enough. Shock rippled across his face. His jaw tightened. His eyes filled with something between gratitude and awe, something raw and unguarded that crew members rarely saw in him. This wasn't just a tattoo. This wasn't just a passenger. This was someone who had once walked through hell so that others could live. Someone who had walked through fire and had done it silently. He glanced around the cabin, the cramped seat she'd been forced into, the passengers who had judged her, the flight attendants who had dismissed her, and disbelief hardened into anger. Not loud anger, not reckless anger, but the type of controlled, righteous anger that comes from witnessing a deep injustice. He straightened, his voice firm, cold, authoritative. "Who moved this passenger out of first class?" Heads turned, conversations halted. Even the flight attendant who had escorted her earlier felt his stomach drop. Because the captain wasn't confused anymore. He wasn't uncertain. He had recognized her. The cabin fell into an uneasy hush as the pilot's voice cut through the low murmur of passengers settling in. Captain Dawson stood tall in the aisle, the crisp precision of his uniform contrasting sharply with the disbelief tightening his jaw. He wasn't merely a pilot in that moment. He was a man who had just witnessed something profoundly wrong, something that twisted his gut because he knew exactly who had been mistreated. The crew sensed a shift in his energy long before he spoke another word. The male flight attendant responsible for moving her stepped forward hesitantly, his forced confidence already crumbling. "Captain, I can explain," he stammered. "There was a seating issue." "There was no seating issue," Dawson said, his voice controlled but razor-sharp, a tone that didn't rise but cut. "Tell me why this passenger, this veteran, is sitting in the back of the aircraft when her boarding pass clearly says first class." Every head around them turned. You could feel the air tighten, the unspoken guilt spreading like a stain through the rows. Passengers who had whispered judgments suddenly avoided eye contact. The woman in the designer outfit up front, who had so confidently declared some seats weren't meant for everyone, shifted uncomfortably, tugging at her sleeves as if she could hide from her own arrogance. The attendant swallowed hard. Captain, she didn't look like. The words slipped out before he realized how they sounded. Dawson's eyes narrowed. She didn't look like what? Silence, brutal, suffocating silence. The woman in 27B didn't move, didn't intervene, didn't defend herself. Her calm presence made the tension feel even heavier, as if her silence itself was a mirror forcing everyone to face what they had done. Captain, another attendant chimed in, trying to redirect the blame. We thought the seat belonged to a higher-tier loyalty customer. So we. You thought wrong, Dawson interrupted, his tone colder now. You didn't check your system, you didn't confirm anything, you simply assumed she didn't belong. The older man she had saved from the falling bag earlier leaned closer, whispering, "Good on him," to his seatmate, who nodded solemnly. Economy passengers understood what fairness felt like. First class, however, was now uncomfortably quiet. Dawson turned to her with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the storm he was unleashing on his crew. "Ma'am, on behalf of this airline, I apologize for your treatment." He didn't bow, but the weight of his respect was clear. No one on this plane, not one person, has the right to question your place. Then he faced the crew again. "She earned the right to sit anywhere on this aircraft," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, long before any of us ever set foot in uniform. A ripple of confusion washed over the first-class passengers, many of whom craned their necks to see who he was talking about. Someone whispered, "What does he mean earned?" Another murmured, "Is she military?" Dawson didn't hesitate. "She is a Navy SEAL." Gasps erupted around him. A few passengers jolted upright. The young attendant from the back took a step backward, her hand flying to her mouth. Someone whispered, "A SEAL, her," and yet another muttered, "I've never seen a woman SEAL before." The cabin vibrated with disbelief, embarrassment, respect, an emotional clash that left shivers running through the rows. The pilot continued, his voice heavy with sincerity. "Years ago, during a classified extraction mission, a SEAL team pulled me out of a downed helicopter. I only saw one face clearly that night." He nodded toward her quietly, hers. The shock on the crew's faces was immediate and unmistakable. Their earlier arrogance evaporated, replaced with shame so thick it could almost be touched. Passengers felt it too, guilt settling in their chests like weighty stones. "She belongs in first class," Dawson said, "and she will sit in first class." He extended his hand to her, not in a commanding gesture, but in one of deep, personal respect. "Please allow me to escort you back." For the first time since she boarded the plane, she spoke more than a few words. Her voice was calm, steady, grounded. "That won't be necessary. I'm fine where I am." But Dawson shook his head softly. "Ma'am, I owe you my life. The least I can offer is your rightful seat." The entire cabin held its breath. Passengers who had previously judged her now looked at her with awe, admiration, and a sting of regret. Even those who had remained neutral felt something shift inside them, an uncomfortable but necessary realization about how easily prejudice forms, how silently assumptions creep in. And in that moment, the truth hung in the air with unmistakable clarity. They hadn't just misjudged her. They had dishonored her. The moment the pilot stepped fully into the cabin, conversations died mid-sentence, and the entire first-class section seemed to collapse into silence. For a second, no one even breathed. His eyes weren't scanning for turbulence reports or malfunctioning equipment. He was locked onto her. The attendants stiffened as they followed his line of sight, confusion flooding their faces because they didn't yet understand what he had noticed the moment she turned. That tattoo, those unmistakable trident edges peeking from beneath her shirt, wasn't just ink. It was a signature, a legacy, a symbol reserved for those who had survived what most people couldn't even imagine. And his reaction made it clear. He recognized exactly what it meant. He took another step toward her, slowly, almost as if approaching someone of far higher rank, someone who commanded respect by presence alone. The attendants, who had tossed orders at her minutes earlier, gaped as though the ground under them had shifted. Then, in a voice that was steady but filled with unmistakable reverence, the pilot spoke directly to her, using a tone no one in first class had heard from him before. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, wondering how someone they had dismissed as out of place could draw such a reaction from the man responsible for flying them across the continent. The woman who had shoved her earlier shrank back into her seat, suddenly aware that she might have made an error of extraordinary proportions. Even the businessman who had rolled his eyes at her during boarding sat up straighter, alarm mixing with humiliation. For years, she had moved through crowds unnoticed, unacknowledged. But now, every pair of eyes in the cabin was focused entirely on her, eyes filled with questions, fear, awe, and dawning regret. Despite the pressure of being the sudden center of attention, she didn't flinch. She didn't puff herself up or look around to enjoy her newfound status. Instead, she met the pilot's gaze with the same calm strength she had carried at the gate, saying nothing, waiting, letting him speak first. That alone told everyone more about who she truly was than any bragging ever could. Whatever the pilot saw in her expression only deepened his respect. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly into one of deference. The attendants' faces drained as they realized the severity of their mistake, because in that still, tense moment, there was no room for doubt. This wasn't just a passenger. This was someone whose presence demanded honor, and whose story was only as the plane continued toward cruising altitude. The tension that had gripped the cabin slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of awe and reflection. Passengers who had moments before judged her now sat in silence, contemplating how easily they had assumed the worst and how wrong those assumptions had been. The pilot had escorted her back to first class, restoring not just her rightful seat, but the dignity that had been stripped from her moments earlier. Yet beyond the simple act of moving her chair, something deeper had been restored, a lesson that respect cannot be assumed, and heroism is often invisible until it reveals itself. This story reminds us that the most extraordinary people are not always the loudest, nor the most conspicuous. Sometimes they walk quietly among us, carrying experiences and strength that would humble the bravest of hearts. She had done nothing to demand recognition, yet she had earned it in every sense, through courage, discipline, and unwavering grace. For viewers watching today, the lesson is clear. Never judge a person by appearances, assumptions, or first impressions. In life, we often overlook quiet strength, fail to recognize unseen achievements, and underestimate those who move through the world silently carrying burdens we cannot imagine. This story exemplifies the power of patience, composure, and the quiet confidence of someone who has faced challenges far greater than the everyday slights of an airplane cabin. Respect is not something to give based on status, dress, or the assumptions of others. It is earned through the recognition of humanity, experience, and courage in all forms. If this swift tale resonated with you, I encourage you to take a moment now to like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Have you ever misjudged someone, only to realize later how wrong you were? Stories like this remind us to pause, reflect, and give respect where it is due. By sharing this video, you help spread a message of humility, empathy, and acknowledgement of unseen heroism that can inspire others to act with kindness in their own lives. Thank you for watching, and remember, true strength is often quiet, yet it leaves a mark on everyone who witnesses it. Once the initial shock had faded and the plane leveled off, an unusual quiet settled over the cabin. Passengers who had been restless or judgmental moments earlier now found themselves lost in reflection. The businessman who had scoffed at her when she boarded first class sat staring out the window, replaying every detail of the interaction, wondering how he could have misjudged someone so completely. The woman in designer clothing twisted her napkin nervously in her lap, cheeks flushed with embarrassment, suddenly aware that her whispered comments had been both cruel and entirely unwarranted. Even the flight attendants, who had initially approached the situation with assumptions and overconfidence, exchanged glances filled with remorse, silently acknowledging that they had failed to treat a passenger with the dignity she deserved. Conversations that restarted were quieter now, careful, almost reverent, as the cabin collectively processed what they had witnessed. A person of extraordinary courage, trained for situations far beyond the understanding of ordinary travelers, had been treated as if she were insignificant. Some passengers began speaking in hushed tones, sharing fragments of what they had heard from the captain. "Did you hear that? She's a Navy SEAL. She actually saved the captain's life on a mission." These whispered exchanges created a ripple of astonishment that moved like electricity through the cabin. For a moment, pride, shame, and admiration mingled in equal measure, forcing everyone to reevaluate their own assumptions and prejudices. Eyes that had previously judged now held respect. Whispers of ridicule were replaced by admiration for her calm composure and quiet dignity. In the back of the plane, economy passengers who had witnessed her landing the falling bag earlier nodded at each other knowingly, connecting the dots between what they had seen and the stories emerging from the first-class cabin. They, too, reflected on the idea that true strength is often invisible, manifesting not through ostentation, but through disciplined action, courage, and integrity. Many admitted, silently to themselves, that their first impressions had been flawed, that they had been too quick to assume, and that humility sometimes comes as a lesson delivered in the most unexpected places. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, a subtle but undeniable change had taken place. The energy in the cabin had shifted from judgment to reflection, from superficial assessment to deeper awareness. The passengers had witnessed something remarkable, not just the recognition of her heroism, but the human capacity to be wrong, to learn, and to grow in the smallest, quietest moments. And though few would admit it aloud, everyone on board had been given a rare and valuable lesson. Never underestimate someone based on appearances, for true valor and grace often arrive silently, leaving a lasting impression on those wise enough to notice. As the flight continued, the flight attendants gradually regained their composure, though their previous arrogance had been replaced with a quiet humility. The male attendant who had first questioned her presence in first class approached cautiously, his steps hesitant as if each one carried the weight of his earlier mistakes. "Ma'am," he began, voice low and sincere, "I owe you an apology. We judged you unfairly and His words faltered as the enormity of the moment weighed on him. The passengers around them watched silently, sensing the gravity of the exchange. She didn't need to speak, didn't need to respond with dramatic gestures. Her calm acknowledgement, just a subtle nod, was enough to grant the apology its due. Another attendant joined, quietly admitting to the crew that assumptions and appearances should never dictate treatment. The crew began to reflect on the chaos they had caused, realizing that in their rush to enforce protocol and manage passengers, they had overlooked the most fundamental rule: respect. They had been too quick to judge her, too willing to believe their biases rather than facts. It was a lesson they would carry with them long after this flight, a moment in which human error collided with exceptional character, producing a humbling wake-up call for all involved. Even the passengers in first class who had whispered judgments earlier began to show small, subtle signs of acknowledgement. Some offered nods of respect when her eyes met theirs. Others adjusted their posture, suddenly aware of how their assumptions had contributed to the uncomfortable moment she had endured. There was no need for words. The recognition was in the energy of the cabin, the quiet, shared understanding that she had been wronged, and that her composure and dignity had left an indelible mark on everyone present. By the time the crew had finished their quiet acknowledgements, the entire cabin seemed to hold a collective breath of relief, as if a tension that had built for minutes had finally been released. Passengers, now mindful of the woman in their midst, treated her presence with the respect it deserved, while the crew learned an invaluable lesson about humility, awareness, and the dangers of assumptions. In these small, deliberate gestures, the quiet apologies, the respectful glances, the renewed professionalism, something remarkable occurred, a shared acknowledgement of human fallibility, paired with recognition of extraordinary courage. It was a moment that would linger in the memory of everyone aboard long after the flight ended. As the flight settled into a steady rhythm, something subtle but unmistakable began to shift among the passengers. Conversations that had once been filled with casual gossip and speculation now carried a tone of reflection and newfound respect. The businessman who had previously scoffed at her boarding first class leaned back in his seat, rubbing his temples as if trying to erase the arrogance of his earlier assumptions. Nearby, the woman in designer clothing fidgeted, eyes downcast, clearly reconsidering her earlier judgments. Around her, others whispered quietly, not about their personal discomfort, but about the remarkable courage and composure of the woman they had misjudged so quickly. The cabin, once tense and judgmental, now hummed with an unspoken acknowledgement that appearances are often deceiving and that true strength does not need validation. It commands it effortlessly. Even passengers seated further back, in the economy section where she had initially been forced, began to notice the subtle changes. A mother quietly explained to her child what it meant to serve in the military, using the woman as a living example of courage and self-discipline. A pair of college students whispered to each other about the Navy SEAL tattoo, clearly impressed and intrigued by the realization that the quiet woman they had previously ignored had endured trials beyond their comprehension. Small acts of acknowledgement, nodding in her direction, offering smiles, and adjusting posture, communicated a silent apology to someone who had endured their assumptions without complaint. In that quiet, reflective space, the cabin transformed from a place of judgment to a classroom of humility, each passenger absorbing lessons about perception, respect, and the courage of those who move silently through the world. By now, even the flight attendants had adjusted their behavior. Where there had once been dismissive gestures and whispered critiques, there was now a careful attentiveness. Every interaction with her, whether handing a drink or assisting with a request, was conducted with a deliberate respect that acknowledged both her presence and her accomplishments. The entire cabin had been subtly but irreversibly changed. A single glimpse of her tattoo, a symbol she had not revealed for attention, but that revealed everything, had forced everyone to confront their biases and reassess their assumptions. It was a quiet revolution of awareness, a testament to how quickly human perception can shift when confronted with undeniable evidence of character, courage, and dignity. By the time the flight attendants began their rounds, offering drinks and snacks, there was a noticeable reverence in the way the cabin moved. Passengers no longer whispered about her, at least not critically, but instead discussed her with admiration, a newfound curiosity, and a silent acknowledgement that they had been wrong. She remained composed, quiet, and unassuming, as though she had expected nothing less. And yet, in her calm presence, she had irrevocably transformed the atmosphere of the plane, reminding everyone that true strength is often invisible until the moment it is recognized. As the flight continued smoothly at cruising altitude, a sense of balance and justice finally settled over the cabin. The woman, now seated comfortably back in first class, no longer felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her. The pilot's acknowledgement, coupled with the crew's genuine apologies, had restored not only her physical place on the plane, but her dignity as well. It was a quiet triumph, not loud or dramatic, but profound in its significance. She didn't boast or demand recognition. Her composure and calm strength spoke volumes to everyone around her. First-class passengers who had initially dismissed her now observed her with unspoken respect, some glancing at her tattoo with a mixture of curiosity and awe, realizing they had underestimated the depth of her experience and character. The flight attendants moved through the cabin differently now, consciously aware of how quickly assumptions can cloud judgment. The male attendant who had escorted her to economy now approached with measured attentiveness, offering small gestures of respect, a drink, a blanket, a polite smile, acknowledgments that spoke louder than words. The younger attendant, who had witnessed her catch the falling bag moments earlier, now understood fully what she had been dealing with, not an ordinary passenger, but someone trained to act with precision, courage, and unshakable calm. In every gesture, the crew demonstrated a newfound awareness, a recognition that the moments of injustice earlier in boarding had been mistakes, and that respect for her, as with all people, must never be assumed. Passengers, too, were changed. Whispered conversations about flight details and trivial inconveniences had been replaced with quiet admiration and reflection. Even those who had initially judged her harshly were now silently acknowledging the lessons they had learned, the danger of assumptions, the value of patience, and the invisible strength that can exist behind unassuming appearances. It was a subtle, collective realization. Dignity cannot be stripped from someone who carries it within themselves, and courage is evident even when it doesn't demand recognition. The plane, once a microcosm of impatience and misjudgment, had become a space of awareness and respect, all sparked by a single individual whose quiet actions and disciplined composure had revealed the extraordinary truth behind appearances. By the time the flight reached its midpoint, a sense of harmony had settled over the cabin. The woman, still calm and unobtrusive, had not changed. She had simply allowed her presence, her actions, and her recognition by the pilot to speak for her. In doing so, she reminded everyone aboard that true strength requires no audience, that respect is earned through action, and that even the smallest gestures of dignity can leave lasting impressions. The lesson was clear, unspoken yet undeniable. Courage, composure, and quiet authority can command attention and admiration far more powerfully than words ever could. As the plane began its descent toward the destination, a sense of closure settled over both the passengers and the crew. The woman, now firmly back in her rightful seat, remained quiet, composed, and dignified, her calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos and misjudgment of boarding. The pilot returned to the cockpit with a renewed sense of respect and admiration, glancing back at her occasionally, acknowledging silently the debt of honor and recognition owed. The crew, transformed by their own mistakes and the courage they had witnessed firsthand, moved through the cabin with professionalism infused with humility, offering every passenger the courtesy and attentiveness that had been lacking moments earlier. First-class passengers who had doubted her now reflected quietly on their own assumptions, realizing how quickly prejudice can cloud judgment and how profoundly it can be corrected by a simple act of recognition and respect. For viewers of this story, the lessons extend far beyond an airplane cabin. It is a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that assumptions are often wrong, and that courage and integrity are qualities that transcend status, clothing, or circumstance. The woman's quiet strength, her composure under scrutiny, and her remarkable actions, both in catching the falling bag and commanding recognition from the pilot, serve as a powerful example of how dignity and resilience can command respect even in the most challenging and unexpected situations. True heroism does not always shout. Sometimes it waits patiently, unrecognized, until the moment arrives when it must be acknowledged. If this swift tale inspired you, I encourage you to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or experiences about moments when you or someone you knew was misjudged, only to be recognized for true strength and courage. Stories like this remind us all to pause before passing judgment, to look deeper, and to honor those whose actions quietly but profoundly impact the world around them. Thank you for joining us today, and remember, strength, courage, and dignity are most powerful when carried quietly, yet their impact is felt by everyone fortunate enough to witness them.